Ysabel was a ghost in the Frost Peak pack, a wolfless slave whose existence was marked only by the rattle of heavy silver chains and the sting of the biting north wind. Dressed in a tattered white off-shoulder gown that had long since lost its purity to bloodstains and grime, she was a living testament to the pack's cruelty. To her tormentors, she was nothing but a broken omega, an orphan too weak to shift, and the favorite target of Princess Vessa's jagged jealousy. While other she-wolves spent their nights dreaming of powerful mates, Ysabel spent hers on the frozen floor of a cell, her inner wolf silenced by a darkness she couldn't name. She was a human-shaped shell in a world of predators, resigned to the belief that fairy tales were lies told to those who still had hope. The night the Alpha King was set to arrive, the air turned lethal. Whispers moved through the pack like a fever, electric, terrified, and breathless. Rovan was coming. The king of the Northern Territories was a legend of cold violence, a man with piercing icy blue eyes who ruled with an iron fist and a heart carved from the very glaciers of his kingdom. He was a man who rejected every political alliance, a king who looked at the most beautiful princesses in the realm and felt only boredom. He didn't want a queen, he wanted a reason to feel something other than the numb call of war. Alpha Edward of Frost Peak saw the king's arrival as his final chance at absolute power. He had groomed his daughter, Princess Vessa, to be the perfect bait, beautiful, sharp-featured, and lethal. But to show the king the discipline of their pack, Edward ordered Ysabel to be displayed like a piece of macabre furniture. She was forced to stand barefoot in the waist-deep snow at the palace gates, her hands clutching the heavy iron chains at her neck to keep the cold metal from searing her skin. She was to be the living statue that welcomed the king's carriage. When the black iron carriage finally cut through the blizzard, the world seemed to stop. Princess Vessa stood on the red carpet, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a predatory smile fixed on her face as she prepared to claim her crown. But the moment Rovan stepped onto the frozen earth, his dominant presence radiating a quiet, possessive danger, his icy gaze didn't land on the princess. His head snapped toward the shadows where Ysabel stood trembling, the scent of her fear and something else, something intoxicating, like winter pine and ancient magic, hitting his senses like a physical blow. His wolf, a beast that had been silent for decades, let out a roar of recognition that shook his very soul. Everything changed in that heartbeat. Ignoring the kneeling royalty and the prepared speeches, the Alpha King walked straight into the snow toward the girl in chains. Vessa watched in silent fury as the most powerful man in the world reached out a gloved hand to cup the chin of a slave. Ysabel looked up, her honey-brown eyes wide with a terror she thought would be her end, unaware that the king had just found his only beginning. If this story pulled you in for even a second, kindly support me with likes, comments and also subscribe. It means the world to me. The heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned open, admitting a gust of frost and the terrifying presence of Alpha King Rovan. He moved with the lethality of a winter storm, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the opulence of the Frost Peak Pack's feast. Gold-trimmed banners and shimmering chandeliers seemed to dim in the wake of his dark, commanding energy. Every high-ranking wolf in the room bowed their head, the air thickening with the scent of submission as the king prowled toward the head table. Princess Vessa waited there like a glittering prize, her dress a cascade of silver silk designed to mirror the king's own icy reputation. She rose, a practiced, seductive smile on her lips as she gestured to the vacant throne beside her. "Welcome, King Rovan," she purred, her voice dripping with the confidence of a woman who had already won. "Your seat is waiting. We have prepared a vintage that even the northern throne would envy." Rovan didn't even look at her. His icy blue eyes were fixed on the far corner of the hall, where a petite, fragile figure stood trembling in the shadows. Ysabel felt his gaze like a brand on her skin. She kept her head lowered, her small hands clutching the heavy iron chains that bound her wrists, the silver links rattling softly in the sudden silence of the room. She was supposed to be a decoration, a silent reminder of the pack's dominance, but to Rowan, she was the only point of light in a room full of vultures. "I find your hospitality lacking, Alpha Edward," Rowan's voice rumbled, a low growl that made the wine in the glasses tremble. He came to a halt, refusing to sit. The dominant posture he held radiated a quiet danger that made even the pack guards shift uneasily. "My king," Edward stammered, his face paling. "Is the feast not to your liking? Vesa has spent weeks—" "I don't care for the princess's efforts," Rowan interrupted, his cold features sharpening. He raised a hand, pointing a single, gloved finger toward Ysabel. The chains around her neck caught the light, and the king's jaw tightened with a suppressed, primal fury. "I will not sit, and I will not drink, unless that girl serves me." Vesa's smile shattered, her eyes flashing with a murderous jealousy. "She is a wolfless slave, my king. A defective omega. It would be an insult to your status to let her touch your cup." Rowan stepped closer to the head table, leaning down until he was inches from Vesa's face. The air around them seemed to drop 20 degrees. "I do not take orders from those who hide their cruelty behind silk," he hissed. "Bring her to me. Now." Ysabel felt the world tilt as a guard shoved her forward. Every step was a struggle, the chains heavy and cold against her bruised skin. As she reached the king's side, her breath hitched. She could smell him, oak, cold steel, and a dark, possessive musk that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Rowan took the golden chalice from the table and held it out to her. His hand brushed hers, and a wildfire of sparks erupted through her veins, a sensation so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. She was a wolfless slave, but in the king's eyes, she saw something she had never encountered before, a terrifying, absolute recognition. Ysabel's fingers trembled as she tilted the heavy golden pitcher, the dark red wine swirling into King Rowan's chalice. The silence in the great hall was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic clinking of the silver chains draped over her delicate wrists. She kept her gaze fixed on the liquid, terrified that if she looked up, she would drown in the icy blue intensity of the man sitting before her. Rowan remained perfectly still, but his predatory focus was locked on the girl's hands. As she leaned forward to finish the pour, the tattered sleeve of her white dress slipped back, revealing more than just pale skin. Rowan's breath hitched, a low, dangerous vibration starting in his chest. Around her slender wrists were deep, angry indentations, permanent grooves carved into her flesh by years of wearing heavy iron. These weren't fresh wounds from a single night of punishment, these were the marks of a lifetime spent in shackles. His eyes tracked the silver links upward to the heavy collar at her throat. It was too thick, too ornate for a simple slave. As Ysabel pulled back, a flicker of light caught the metal, revealing faint, shimmering etchings on the inside of the band. Rowan's wolf snarled in his mind, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. He recognized those marks. They weren't just decorative, they were suppression runes, designed to block the flow of a wolf's energy to its host. A sudden, chilling realization washed over him, cooling his rage into a calculated, lethal calm. Alpha Edward and the Frost Peak Elders weren't just abusing a wolfless omega, they were systematically burying someone powerful. They had bound her in silver and runes to ensure her wolf could never wake, keeping her in a state of perpetual fragility so she could never claim what was hers. They weren't punishing a slave, they were hiding a queen. "You're shaking," Rowan remarked, his voice a velvet caress that held the weight of a death sentence. Ysabel flinched, her honey-brown eyes darting to his for a fraction of a second before she looked away. I am cold, my king," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Rovan reached out, his large, warm hand covering her bruised wrist. The contact sent a shock of electric heat through them both, a wildfire that seemed to melt the very frost on the windows. He felt her pulse jump like a trapped bird against his palm. He didn't just feel her fear, he felt the dormant power beneath her skin, thrumming against the silver restraints. Across the table, Alpha Edward shifted, his eyes darting nervously between the king and the slave. She is clumsy, King Rovan. Perhaps the princess should. The princess should remain silent, Rovan snapped, his gaze never leaving Ysabel. He leaned in closer, his scent of cold steel and winter pine enveloping her. These chains are far too heavy for such a small thing. I think it's time we saw what lies beneath the iron. The sheer possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver of hope, and a new, deeper kind of terror, straight through Ysabel's soul. The shadows of the frozen garden offered no warmth, but they provided the only sanctuary Ysabel knew. She stumbled through the knee-deep snow, her breath coming in ragged, crystalline puffs that vanished into the moonlight. The silver chains clutched in her frozen hands felt heavier than ever, the metal leaching the remaining heat from her bones. She had fled the great hall the moment the feast dissolved into a tense political standoff, knowing that Princess Vessa's fury would be lethal. To the princess, Ysabel was a smudge on her perfect night, a servant who had dared to touch the king's hand. She collapsed against the trunk of an ancient, frost-covered oak, her tattered white dress blending into the drifts. "Please," she whispered to the empty air, "just let the cold take me before she finds me. The cold is a cruel master, little one. It does not grant mercy." Ysabel bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Rovan emerged from the swirling snow, his black cloak billowing behind him like wings. He looked like a god of winter, his icy blue eyes glowing with a terrifying luminescence. He didn't look angry, he looked hungry, his gaze sweeping over her small, shivering frame with a possessiveness that made the air around them vibrate. "Go back," she gasped, shrinking into the bark of the tree. "If they see you with me again, they'll kill me. Vessa, she'll make sure there's nothing left of me." Rovan stepped into her space, his sheer heat radiating against her frozen skin. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an invisible weight, pinning her in place. He looked at the heavy collar, his jaw tight enough to snap bone. He could feel the lie of this pack, the way they called her, it, or slave, to strip away the soul he could clearly see. "They call you many things," Rovan said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that seemed to hum in the very earth beneath them. "Omega. Slave. Wretch. But none of them belong to you." He stepped closer, his scent of crushed pine and ancient ice drowning out the smell of her fear. For the first time, he gathered his power, the ancient authority of the Alpha King rising within him. But he didn't use it to crush her, he used it to create a tether of truth between them. "I am the king," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers, "and I command you. Not as a master to a slave, but as a wolf to its mate. Tell me who you are. Tell me your real name." The Alpha command rippled through Ysabel, but it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a key turning in a rusted lock. The silence that had lived in her throat for years finally broke. "Ysabel," she breathed, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. "My name is Ysabel." Rovan's expression shifted, a dark, predatory satisfaction crossing his features. "Ysabel," he repeated, "the name of vow. Remember it. Because it is the last thing they will hear before I burn this pack to the ground for what they've done to you." The steam in the wash-house was thick and suffocating, smelling of lye and the damp, bitter scent of fear. Ysabel had barely slipped back inside the pack house when a hand clamped over her mouth, dragging her backward into the stone-walled laundry room. She was thrown onto the wet floor, the heavy silver chains clashing against the tile with a sound that echoed like a death knell. "You think a name makes you a person?" Vessa's voice hissed through the vapor. The princess stood over her, the elegant silk of her gown pinned back, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly malice. Beside her stood Mira, a high-ranking she-wolf who lived to feed Vessa's ego. Mira held a long iron rod, the tip resting inside the coals of a small stove used for heating water. The end was glowing a dull, lethal red. "The king looked at you as if you were a diamond instead of the dirt you are," Vessa snarled, pacing around Ysabel like a shark in shallow water. "He rejected my hand because he was distracted by a wolfless, broken slave. I can't kill you yet, my father still has uses for your silence, but I can make sure he never wants to look at you again." Ysabel scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the soapy stones. "Please, princess," she begged, her voice cracking. "I didn't ask for his attention. I am nothing to him." "Exactly," Vessa spat. "And once I marked that pretty, youthful face, even a blind man wouldn't touch you." "Mira, hold her down." Mira moved with the speed of a predator, her wolf-enhanced strength making Ysabel's struggles look pathetic. She pinned Ysabel's shoulders to the floor, her knees digging into the girl's fragile ribs. Ysabel cried out as her head hit the stone, her eyes wide with terror as she watched Vessa take the glowing iron from the coals. The heat from the rod shimmered in the air, a terrifying orange light that illuminated Vessa's triumphant grin. "Let's see how many secrets you can tell when your skin is bubbling, Ysabel," the princess whispered, lowering the brand toward Ysabel's cheek. The smell of singed fabric filled the air as the heat drew closer. Ysabel squeezed her eyes shut, her body shaking so violently the chains rattled against the floor in a frantic, desperate rhythm. She waited for the agony, for the brand to destroy the only thing she had left, her identity. But just as the heat touched the fine hairs on her skin, the heavy wooden door of the washhouse didn't just open, it exploded inward, the stone frame splintering under a force so primal it felt like the mountain itself had moved. The steam cleared instantly as a freezing wind rushed in, and there stood Rovan, his blue eyes no longer icy, but burning with the black fire of an alpha king whose mate was in peril. The scream that tore from Ysabel's throat was cut short by the sheer pressure of the alpha king's aura. Rovan didn't walk into the washhouse, he descended upon it like a god of war. The iron rod in Vessa's hand clattered to the stone floor as she was thrown backward by the sheer force of his entry. Mira, who had been pinning Ysabel down, was flung aside as if she were made of straw, hitting the far wall with a sickening thud. In a heartbeat, Rovan was on the floor, his massive frame shielding Ysabel's trembling body. His growl wasn't human, it was a tectonic vibration that rattled the very foundations of the building. He didn't look at the steam or the laundry, he looked at the glowing iron rod inches from Ysabel's face, and then he looked at Vessa. His icy blue eyes had turned into twin voids of predatory blackness. "Back away," he whispered, the quietness of his voice 1,000 times more terrifying than a shout. "My king!" Vessa gasped, scrambling to her feet, her face pale as death. "She is just a slave." She was being disciplined for her insolence. "You cannot be here." Rovan stood up slowly, and as he did, the temperature in the room plummeted until the steam turned into a fine mist of ice. He reached down and snatched the hot iron rod from the floor with his bare hand. The metal hissed against his palm, but he didn't even flinch. With a flex of his wrist, he snapped the thick iron in two like a dry twig and tossed the pieces at Vessa's feet. "Listen well, princess of nothing," Rovan said, his voice echoing with the absolute authority of the Northern Throne. "The treaty is dead. I came here looking for a queen, but I found only a den of cowards and torturers." Alpha Edward appeared in the doorway, breathless and horrified, taking in the scene of his daughter cowering and the king standing over the chained slave. "Rovan, please, let us explain. The girl is mine," Rovan roared, the sound shattering the glass windows of the wash-house. He turned his lethal gaze toward Edward, then back to the girls. "If another hand touches her, if a single hair on her head is harmed by anyone in this pack, I will not only sever that hand, I will pull this mountain down upon your heads. There is no marriage. There is no alliance. There is only my mate and the blood I will spill to keep her." He reached down, and for the first time, his touch was impossibly gentle. He slid his arms beneath Ysabel's fragile form, lifting her and her heavy silver chains into his chest. She buried her face in his neck, her tears wetting his fur collar, as he walked past the silent, terrified nobility. He didn't look back. He had found his bride, and the North was about to go to war for her. The sanctuary of Rovan's private quarters was filled with the scent of burning cedar and the soft, rhythmic clinking of silver as he carefully adjusted the furs around Ysabel. She had fallen into a fitful sleep, her small hand still clutching the hem of his black tunic as if terrified he would vanish into the frost. Rovan watched her, his heart a storm of protective rage and newfound hope, until a sharp, rhythmic tapping at the balcony door broke the silence. Cade, Rovan's most trusted beta, stepped in from the blizzard, his dark hair dusted with snow. He didn't say a word, but the grim set of his jaw and the heavy leather-bound book in his hand spoke volumes. He moved to the flickering fireplace, beckoning Rovan away from the bed. "It took more than a little persuasion to get this from Bram's private vault," Cade whispered, sliding the ancient ledger onto the low table. "The old wolf nearly took my head off, but once I saw the seals on the cover, I knew why they were so desperate to keep it buried." Rovan opened the book, his eyes scanning the cramped, ink-stained entries. His breath hitched as he reached the final pages, the handwriting changing to a shaky, hurried script. There, recorded in the blood-red ink of the pack's history, was the truth that shattered the lie of the Frost Peak pack. Ysabel was not an orphan found in the woods. She was the only daughter of the previous High Alpha King, the true heir to the Northern Throne who had supposedly perished in the Great Fire. The ledger detailed a dark conspiracy led by Bram and Alpha Edward to seize control. They hadn't just enslaved her, they had commissioned a master smith to forge the silver collar she wore. It was cursed, etched with forbidden runes designed to drain the soul of the beast. They hadn't just silenced her wolf, they were literally siphoning her royal power to fuel their own fading bloodlines. They didn't just steal her life, Cade, Rovan growled, his voice a low, vibrating tremor that made the shadows in the room dance. They stole her spirit. That collar isn't a leash, it's a parasite. He looked back at Ysabel, her youthful face pale against the dark furs. Every bruise, every scar, and every rattle of those chains now had a deeper, more sinister meaning. She was a queen in exile, a goddess bound in iron by men too small to rule. Rovan's hand tightened on the ledger until the leather groaned. The political treaty was no longer just dead, it was a declaration of war. He wasn't just taking his mate home, he was preparing to reclaim a stolen crown. "Prepare the men," Rovan commanded, his icy blue eyes glowing with a lethal, predatory light. "Tonight, we don't just leave Frost Peak. We burn the legacy of the liars to the ground." The air in the room grew heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient power as Rovan knelt before Ysabel. She was awake now, her eyes wide and rimmed with silver tears as she watched the king pull a ceremonial dagger from his belt. The blade caught the light of the dying fire, but there was no fear in her gaze, only a desperate, flickering hope that mirrored his own. "It will be over soon, Ysabel," Rovan murmured, his voice thick with a raw, primal devotion. "They used iron to cage you, but they forgot that the blood of a true king can break any seal. Without flinching, Rovan drew the edge of the blade across his palm. Thick, crimson alpha blood welled up instantly, glowing with a faint, golden heat. Ysabel gasped as he reached out, pressing his stained palm directly against the cold silver of the collar at her throat. The moment his blood touched the metal, the suppression runes etched into the iron began to hiss and scream like living things. A foul, black smoke rose from the collar, the dark magic of the Frost Peak Elders dissolving under the purity of the king's sacrifice. Rovan didn't let go, even as the silver began to vibrate violently against his skin. He moved his hand down to her wrists, coating the heavy shackles in his life force. The iron began to glow, not with the red heat of a furnace, but with a blinding, ethereal white. Now, Rovan commanded, his voice echoing with the strength of 1,000 ancestors. Wake up, Ysabel. Reclaim what was stolen. With a sound like shattering glass, the collar and the chains didn't just break, they disintegrated into fine, glittering dust. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then, a pulse of energy rippled out from Ysabel's chest, throwing the furniture back against the walls and blowing the balcony doors wide open. Ysabel arched her back as a radiant silver light erupted from her skin. It wasn't the dim glow of an omega, but a brilliant, lunar fire that had been suppressed for centuries. The light poured from her eyes and mouth, illuminating the room until the shadows were completely erased. Rovan watched in awe as the wolfless girl was consumed by the aura of a high alpha. The air around her began to hum with the song of 1,000 white wolves, and for the first time in her life, Ysabel wasn't just breathing, she was roaring. The slave was gone. In her place sat a creature of myth and starlight, her skin shimmering with a divine frost. The curse was broken, and the true Queen of the North had finally opened her eyes. The great hall exploded in a symphony of violence as Alpha Edward and Vesa charged, their faces contorted into masks of desperate, murderous greed. They knew that if Ysabel survived the night, their lives would be buried under the weight of her crown. Edward shifted mid-stride, a gray, mangy beast leaping through the air, while Vesa pulled a jagged silver dagger from her bodice, the blade coated in a lethal paralytic. Kill her. Vesa shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. Kill her before the light takes her. Ysabel stood paralyzed in the center of the silver radiance, her breath hitching as the sheer volume of power flooded her veins. She was caught between two worlds, her body stretching and aching as her wolf struggled to break through the final remnants of the curse. She saw the silver blade descending toward her heart, a flash of cold death aimed at her throat. She didn't have time to scream. Rovan moved with a speed that defied the physical world. He didn't shift, he didn't need to. He threw himself in front of Ysabel, his massive frame acting as an unbreakable wall of muscle and fur. The silver dagger meant for her chest buried itself deep into his shoulder instead. Rovan let out a guttural roar of agony, the silver poisoning his alpha blood instantly, but he did not move. He grabbed Vesa by the throat even as Edward's wolf tore at his flank, anchoring himself to the floor to ensure Ysabel remained untouched. Rovan. Ysabel's voice wasn't a human cry anymore, it was a frequency that shattered the remaining chandeliers. The sight of his blood, the dark, rich crimson of the king who had sacrificed everything for a slave, was the final spark. The silver light around her turned into a supernova. Her bones cracked and reformed in a rhythmic thrum of ancient magic. The fragile girl in the tattered white dress vanished, replaced by a towering creature of myth. A massive, ancient white wolf, larger than any alpha in the room, stood where Ysabel had been. Her fur was the color of falling snow, her eyes two burning pits of molten gold. The air in the hall froze solid as she let out a howl that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command that forced every wolf in the room to their knees. With a single, predatory swipe of her paw, she sent Edward flying across the hall, and as she turned her golden gaze toward the cowering Vessa, the princess realized too late that the slave was dead, and the queen had come for her head. Rovan, slumped against the dais and bleeding from his silver wound, looked up and smiled. His mate was finally whole, and she was more terrifyingly beautiful than anything he had ever imagined. The great hall was no longer a place of feasting, it had become a court of divine judgment. Ysabel, in her massive white wolf form, moved with a grace that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. The silver light radiating from her fur cast long, dancing shadows against the stone walls, reflecting the terror in the eyes of the corrupt elders. Bram and his conspirators tried to flee, but the doors didn't just close, they froze shut, sealed by the ancient winter magic that flowed through the true heir's veins. With a low, resonating growl that vibrated through the floorboards, Ysabel reclaimed her birthright. She didn't need to tear throats to destroy them, the sheer weight of her alpha presence forced the traitors to their shadows. As they collapsed, their own wolves whimpering in submission, the stolen power they had siphoned for years withered away. Vessa and Edward were stripped of their titles and banished to the frozen wastes, destined to wander the same cold they had used as a weapon against a helpless girl. The transition back to her human form was a waterfall of starlight. When the glow faded, Ysabel stood in the center of the hall, her tattered white dress replaced by a shimmering gown of frost and moonlight that seemed to grow from her very skin. Her long black hair flowed like a river of ink against her glowing shoulders, and her eyes, no longer filled with fear, held the steady, piercing gold of a monarch. Rovan stood, his shoulder wound already knitting together beneath the warmth of her proximity. He didn't approach her as a master or even a savior, but as an equal. He knelt before her, offering his hand, and for the first time, it was the king who looked up at his queen with reverence. "The north is yours, Ysabel," he murmured, his voice thick with pride. "It always has been." Ysabel took his hand, pulling him up to stand beside her. She looked out at the gathered pack members, the Omegas who had been silenced, the warriors who had been misled, and she saw the dawn breaking through the high windows. The snowy night of her enslavement, the rattle of the silver chains, and the taste of lie and blood were gone, melted away by the rising sun of her reign. Together, Ysabel and Rovan didn't just unite two packs, they forged a new empire. She was no longer a ghost in her own home, she was the Snow Queen, the Alpha who ruled the frost and the flame alike. By Rovan's side, she led with a mercy born of her suffering and a strength born of her survival. The chains were broken, the wolf was awake, and the dawn of the north had finally arrived. We have watched Ysabel rise from a girl in silver chains to a queen of starlight and frost. We've seen Rovan defy a kingdom to protect a wolfless slave, who turned out to be the greatest power the North has ever seen. But every great story has moments that make us pause and wonder, what if? I want to hear from you, the pack. If you were standing in the shoes of our characters, how would you have handled the cold halls of Frost Peak? Let's dive into the what-ifs. Thank you for staying with me till this moment, and if you'd like to support me, kindly like, comment and subscribe to the channel as means a lot to me. Till next time. Bye.